Hey, I thought I'd do a quick lesson on melodies. So I decided, I don't know why I got in my head that maybe because I just watched it with my daughter, E.T. And generally just if if you can hear a melody, you kind of know what's going on with it. I decided to just sort of listen to an orchestra recording and learn a bunch of the lines from it. And one thing I think is really interesting is that John Williams has written some of the most, iconic melodies that we remember, like regular people remember. And yeah, a lot of it's like you can find the original composer or whatever that he kind of stole it from and then modified it or whatever. But regardless, there's a lot to learn in terms of just like strong melody writing. And what's also interesting is it doesn't, tonality wise, it's not like anything ever stays in just one key center. I mean, and then he's sort of a master of manipulating like modal colors, tension and release. There's just really good melodic practices. So how do you become better at melody? I think you look at good melodies. If you just take like, okay, well that's just C major, right? I think one thing that's kind of interesting, two things that stick out just from that first part is, you notice it's not just scalar. So he starts with a perfect fifth. So the way that the phrase starts. So even if you were just going to play a scale, look how much cooler it sounds if you start with a perfect fifth. Right? Those kind of things. Just doing those kind of things makes it better. I'll notice he also doesn't just go straight down. There's a little turn, and then now that's just down a triad, but you could also think of it, so you're putting triads in your thing, and this is a second inversion major triad. So, there's using different intervals. So again, if I took this, so I'm starting with a perfect fifth, or let's see, where did I start it? And then if you, instead of just going straight up, what if we do a little, something like that, right? It becomes more interesting. I also think ending a phrase with a perfect fourth down is a really kind of a cool way to just make something sound a little more interesting and maybe more modern. So even if you just, that kind of, it's a really kind of a neat way to end a phrase. It just makes it sound more interesting. Those kind of things. I think that's something to learn. So now, we went through that, and then the next part, now we go to an octave. So he's not just repeating the exact intervals, he's actually, but repeating the sort of movement, right? So it's some kind of variety of. Now notice too, the key changed here. It's kind of like a modal borrowing. Before there's this F, and then now we're F sharp. So again, another big interval. So he kind of keeps the same shape of the line in a way, and then, but sort of changes the intervals a little bit. So imagine, if you will, now you have this, you can keep like a sort of an idea through it, and you can kind of create your own melodies. But also the modal borrowing, you change the color of it. So he didn't just stay in C major, right? He went and borrowed, in a sense, another modal color. And then now we get to an E flat. So it goes back to the F and then E flat. then there's this big interval again. So that, so these are just sort of things to learn. So we went through sort of 3 different modal colors there. And I'll put tension back that on the C, which is where we started. And again, notice there's that little turnaround thing. Now, I kind of knew that melody up to that point, but then there's this next melody that's a really interesting one. Right? Really cool melody. And there's so much chromaticism in it. As far as the shape goes. So it's kind of a... so that in and of itself is kind of an interesting sounding line, because it sort of implies a diminished sort of sound, right? But then he goes here, so we're still... So it's just a nice little... At this point we haven't... we're kind of staying in this, which is kind of like an F sharp key, is the key center. But then there's a G, back to the F sharp. So he puts this little tension thing in here, and again there's the perfect 4th down, and then up a 3rd. Just really kind of a cool idea. And then these little things. Notice he repeats that. Something always happens to the melody. It always like changes and contorts. So instead of just repeating an idea, something should happen to the melody. These kind of things you gotta kind of learn about. So it's like... you can learn a lot just like kind of looking at it. The other part I want to show you is just at the end. There's a part where the flute comes in and he switches to a Lydian sound. And it's, right? Like what a cool it's all these colors, these colors of melodic ideas. Again, he uses the perfect 5th, and then lands on a note that's which is the 9th. Which the 9ths don't tend to sound like at a place. They sort of sound just like a color. They end up sounding like a color as opposed to adding a bunch of tension or anything like that. They don't quite resolve. They're certainly not resolving to the sound, but they sort of just put you in this. It's not quite totally resolved, but sort of mystical space or something. And that happens a lot just in general with 9ths. If you have a C, E, G, and then you play a D on top, right? It sounds really consonant, but it adds sort of a mystical quality in a sense. I don't know. It's a terrible word because it doesn't really mean anything, but there's just a kind of a color. Now the Lydian is that F sharp, and that's a very striking sound. Anytime you go, right? We've heard that sound, and so again, I guess I'm going to leave it there. But I think these are just kind of cool things you can pick up from melodies that we love and adore and whatnot, and not be afraid to explore different, modal kind of sounds and explore, the tension and release of a line. So much stuff to learn from that. There's intervallic leaps but they resolve or they move around. That doesn't tend to do any scalar things very long before changing direction, even if it's just going. Things like that. All that stuff just makes the line more interesting, makes it a more interesting melody. But even that, he never really stay on that very long either, right? Because he would. There would be some kind of intervallic thing. And most of his lines, I noticed they end with some kind of interval, like a larger than a second interval. So whatever line you're doing, work on trying to play a line, that ends with something other than a second. So if you think you're going to end on this G, you might do something like that. If you're targeting that, or something like that, all that stuff adds intrigue to the sound and, gives it an interesting melody. So I hope that was useful and interesting. This went longer than I thought it would, but hey, it's cool. Later.